Picky eating is a common phrase that we use to describe the eating habits that are qualified as very choosy or very particular. Children are notoriously picky, and so sometimes a child may be referred by a therapist as a problem feeder. Now, this term problem feeder can be really vague and confusing, especially to a parent who is thinking all children are notoriously picky and all of my friends' kids are picky, so what makes my child a problem feeder? Now, the prevalence of any feeding challenge, which includes a picky eating, problem feeding, any feeding challenge, is generally 20% in the general pediatric population. And it jumps to somewhere between 50 to 90% within the autism spectrum population. So we do see almost double the number of children presenting with some sort of feeding challenges within the autism spectrum community. So now I really want to break down and explain the difference between a picky eater and a problem feeder who perhaps might need some therapeutic intervention to address the feeding challenge. Picky eaters typically will eat at least 30 different foods. They have a decreased range of foods in their repertoire, but it's usually the minimum is around 30. And whereas when we start to consider someone being a problem feeder, usually that child has a very restricted and narrow range of foods in their repertoire, which is usually less than 20 different foods. And for picky eaters, foods often get lost due to burnout. They will eat their favorite food again and again and again, and then one day flat out refuse because of something called a food jag. A food jag is, in short, when a child will repeat their favorite food again and again and again, and then abruptly stop because of fatigue. So picky eaters usually bring that food back into their diet after a couple of weeks break, whereas unfortunately with a problem feeder, they're not only more susceptible to food jags, but it's more likely that these foods will not be reacquainted with them after dropping the foods. So although picky eaters have a very decreased and narrow range of variety of foods that they eat, picky eaters generally will be able to tolerate new foods on their plate. Even, albeit reluctantly, they may not want to touch it, they may not want to taste it, they may not like how it looks, and they may complain, but they can certainly tolerate a new food on their plate. We begin to consider if a child is a problem feeder when we see behaviors or certain behaviors are reported to us that look like a lot of crying at the dinner table, a lot of meltdowns, particularly in the presence of a novel food. There is a complete refusal. These children do not want new foods on their plate. Now, picky eaters generally eat at least one food from most food textures. So when I say food texture, what I mean is smooth, crunchy, soft, wet, dry. So picky eaters generally will eat at least one thing from a variety of textures or nutrition groups. So they'll have one protein in their diet, one vegetable, one fruit, even if it's only one. Now, problem feeders tend to refuse and omit entire categories of food texture or nutrition groups. These are the children, our kiddos, who will only eat brown food, who will only eat crunchy, dry food, who don't like anything wet, who do not have a single vegetable in their diet. So, and another kind of hallmark between a picky eater and a problem feeder is that when picky eaters come to the dinner table, they frequently have their own food or different food from what the rest of the family is eating. You know, they eat with the family, but they have their own, they have their nuggets or their pasta or whatever they like to eat. They have their food frequently. Now, for problem feeders, this happens all the time. They generally do not eat with the rest of the family, and this goes back to the difficulty tolerating the presence of new food in the vicinity, and they always eat something different from the rest of the family. Picky eaters and problem feeders are both susceptible to food JAGs. Children on the autism spectrum, like I said, are almost twice as likely to have a feeding challenge, and with that is an increased association with something called food JAGs. Food JAGs are particularly important to pay attention to for children on the autism spectrum. A food JAG is when a person eats the same food prepared the same way every single day, or potentially even at every meal. So, it's no surprise that our kiddos on the spectrum are more susceptible to food jagging because our children like sameness. They like routine. They like things that repeat again and again. So they're very susceptible to eating, and they enjoy eating the same thing at every meal, every day. So now the problem with food JAGs is that inevitably the child will get burned out. And often with a problem feeder, they get burned out and this food becomes permanently lost. So here we have a kiddo who is on the spectrum, who may have a communication or speech delay, who is only eating a range of maybe 20 different foods, and who appears to be growing well, who's eating 20 foods and who's growing well, who doesn't appear to have a problem with nutrition, who now suddenly has dropped down to 19. So that 5% decrease is very significant. So really what we as speech therapists, feeding therapists, parents, the biggest priority that should always be at the forefront of our mind is not to let our children food jag.